That's a wonderful question, and thank you so much for asking it. There are at least five ways I could approach this, and none in particularly better order than the other. But I'm going to show you this book by Richard French, who is an ornithologist who spent his life in Trinidad and Tobago. And it's a wonderfully old-fashioned book with copious notes and these beautiful illustrations. So I was very lucky to have this book when I was very, very young. We had it in common in my family, but I put my stamp in it because I had this rubber stamp. And we used to identify birds in the garden, but not in a sort of classificatory, we want to have samples of that way, but more what's our neighbor's name. So that was one way that it started, really. And then another more immediate prompt for the birds in Like a Tree Walking is working with Caroline Bergvall, who was working with the old Irish poem and legend of the King Sweeney, who was driven mad by the sound of church bells and began to fly from tree to tree. And she asked a number of people to be part of an extraordinary performance at the International Literary Festival in Dublin, where sound artists gradually fed back our transformed voices into a chorus of birdsong. So we were overwhelmed by our own cheeping by the end as the lights dimmed. So just actual interaction with that text and those people in that event was another reason that the birds are in the book. A third reason that birds are in the book are really just I hadn't realized this until a few years ago, and I put this in my book on Draining Sea, but not particularly clearly, is that birds are for me a way of keeping time. So when I was in Trinidad as a child, I took it for granted that you'd hear a particular tone of in the Cascade's call. The Cascade's yellow and brown and black and white bird, which is a little bit cuckoo-like in its behaviours, somewhat aggressive. But you'd hear a falling tone in its call in the evening and a rising tone in the morning. You'd also hear a sort of chorus from the parrots in the morning, which you would never hear in the evening. And internally, my clock knew how to set itself, and one of the ways that I felt discomposed and started experiencing dissociation in other places was when I heard birds doing other things, or no birds at all, for example, in very sealed, double-glazed environments. And one of the great pleasures of being a Charles Causley poet in residence, which I was this year in Cornwall, was being in a double aspect room where there were completely different birds, very, very loudly singing. So there was surround sound that immediately told me when I woke up, you're somewhere definite, but it's not Scotland, and it's not Trinidad. If it was Scotland, it would be a seagull stamping. So I was able to wake up feeling completely embodied rather than dissociated. Then another reason is just having had experiences of illness of various kinds. And once I was hit by a speeding police car in my final year as an undergraduate, and I went home to Trinidad because I wasn't getting adequate treatment in Oxford. And with concussion, I wasn't able to read for months because the text looked like worms that was wriggling in front of my eyes and changing size. And I asked my father, who also was often ill, how did he manage having hours and hours doing nothing? And he said he would listen to things like the birds. And I remember lying there next to him, learning to tap into the sounds of birds as something to do as a form of both concentration and relaxation, and a distraction from a brain that physically wasn't working, the head that was just ringing with pain. And I think we're up to four there. And a fifth reason would be just hearing interesting things about birds now and then. So my colleague, the Old Norse scholar Alaric Hall, when I was in Leeds, told me that birds were the closest thing to dinosaurs. And I remember rewriting some of Shakespeare's sonnets, replacing the word bird with dinosaur, just for my own personal pleasure. Bare ruined choirs where once sweet dinosaurs sang. But Also learning that Francis of Assisi, the Italian saint, is the first known named Italian author that we have, and obviously was very inspired by birds and birdsong. And I remember reciting some of his poems to the birds in Trinidad pre-dawn when the chorus was just starting up. There's a wonderfully sort of proto-Goth way in which he puts Sister Death alongside Sister Water and all the other things. And yes, also Emma Dillon, with whom I was at college, and she's a musicologist, once telling me about a study she was reading of birds who stylized song so much that it didn't seem to be about mating or survival, because sometimes when they were stylizing song, they would fall off the bough they were perching on because they were so wrapped up in the music that they were elaborating. And that sort of reminded me of some poets, not having much survival instinct, but spinning out their lines. I put that in my third book, Dark and Unaccustomed Words. Sorry if that was quite a long answer. A lot of birds, and here's a plushy velociraptor. So, one reason is that I grew up, as I keep saying, in Trinidad, where there was conscious engagement with other literatures and literary forms, not only the canonical ones, but also oral ones. So, for example, the Shakespeare Pierrot is a traditional carnival character who would recite large bits of Shakespeare by heart. But then there's also the Pierrot Grenade, who is a simple Pierrot who was supposed to be a bit of a fool character, but who was extremely quick-witted and would misspell or respell things and create extraordinary punning repartee in a mix of patois and Trinidad English. So that idea of always being in dialogue partly comes from those performance traditions. Then again, doing medieval studies at Oxford follows on very naturally from traditional carnival, because when you look at medieval studies, whether texts are anonymous or named, there's always a great sense of authorities and tradition and other texts either being around, a bit like what you call, dew ponds, those pools which appear with the rain, where cattle and birds can drink. So texts that sometimes just appear in the margins of other texts or between the lines. And then there's also the tweaking the nose way that medieval or early authors could use citation. They could also use it quite naughtily to be politically satirical or blasphemous. I always was surprised, for example, that the rules of the T.S. Eliot Prize forbid collections with more than a certain percentage of translation or allusion, because by that rule, T.S. Eliot wouldn't have been able to enter the wasteland. And I always wonder exactly how that works. And now my angry reason is to do with anti-colonial readings, because there's not exactly a right-wing narrative, but a sort of soft, liberal, personally offended narrative that we are completely competent to review and read and interpret any literature from anywhere. And if there's a program like the Scots BIPOC writers or Ledbury critics, that's for special pleading and skewing criticism somehow. Whereas in point of fact, those programs only exist because the so-called normal or universal ways of criticizing and reviewing and interpreting literature are incredibly lacking. And sometimes I used to think that people were struck with the demon of stupidity when they read texts by writers of color. And then I realized it wasn't that, but that they were being kind by lowering their standards and not applying the same standards of differentiation and individualization and care and competence, that by being blunter, I think they might even have thought they were being kind because they expect to find less there or something. I remember meeting a very brilliant critic who was going to be on a panel with me, and this critic said, and in this poem where you talk about, and I said that poem's not about me at all, and I started telling her how it was a fusion of different experiences and input, going back to a film of infrared photography of dancers I had seen in my teens, and she became really upset with me and didn't want to engage with me much on the panel, because the way to read my book was autobiographical. So I think this is my angry reason for putting in allusions and dedications. It's a way of saying, hey, look, put the work in. These texts are not just documentary. They're in living dialogue with the dead and gone, and with the here and present, and the there and elsewhere. And you had better pull your socks up and do some homework. Look, I'm enjoying myself, talking to sheep farmers and invoking the ghost of Dante. And if you aren't doing the same in your review, well, you know, your loss, but you'll probably get £500 or £30 or whatever it is they pay reviewers. But I actually don't care, because I'm going to blank off back to the sheep farm and enjoy myself talking to a sheep farmer who's reading and listening to Shostakovich while he writes. So. Yes, that was an easy one, but also not just in terms of a conscientious society, but a society that is true and also pleasurable, because there seems to be a sort of nervous constraint, like non-consensual bondage, where people are nervously tittering around the base of a statue of good language, or how much is allowable in a poem. And just this week I was discussing the poets Zohar Atkins and Loretta Collins Klober with students at the University of York. We're recording this in the middle of May 2022, so it is a summer term discussion. And we're looking at Loretta weaving in Spanish into different kinds of English, and how this creates new aesthetics which are truer to the way that people think and speak. It's more like the music that she would dance to. It's more like the way that people would gossip. It's more like what you'd hear walking along the street. And there are also some incredibly beautiful sort of collocations of syllables, liquids and semi-vowels, which you get by weaving the Spanish into the English, which you wouldn't get otherwise. Yellows and purples. You could experience it as in a synesthetic way. With Zohar Atkins, he's a rabbi and a philosopher as well as a poet. We were looking at a poem by him which looks at King David dancing before the ark, his garment lifting up and scandalizing his wife, and the joy and exuberance and the contempt, and how all of that is equally mysterious in terms of what it might mean before God or before a God. What I love about that poem is there are so many voices in it. There's a woman talking to another woman, and a man talking to his husband, and someone using the word princess, and someone using the word strap-on, and then what seems to be Zohar's voice, or somebody like Zohar, coming in a very gentle rabbi-like way with a maybe and a perhaps towards the end. And this reminds me of Judaic traditions of commentary. So it's a way of getting the kind of noise of millennia of learned and popular commentary into one poem that reads both dramatically and lyrically. I think this is amazing.